All right, so you remember this, right? So inflation we defined, sort of roughly speaking, as a rise in the overall price level, and we saw this with the GDP deflator. So these are screenshots from earlier presentations of what would happen when the prices of oranges and apples rose. So we talked about how to define this GDP deflator, right? This is all old hat. So just to remind you of the sort of conundrum here. So we're talking about a rise in the overall price level. Now, in some cases, that can be really, really clear, right? So in this case, we have oranges and apples. So the price of oranges rises from $3. The price of apples was originally $2. They both rise now to $6 and $5. So basically, the price of both forms of fruit have increased, right? So in a case where literally every single price increases, it's pretty clear that we've had a rise in the overall price level, right? That nobody's going to have there's not much controversy there. But what happens in a case like this, where, one of the prices rises and one of them falls, right? In the real world, this is a bit closer to reality, right? In the real world, this is closer to reality. This case is a bit closer to reality, right? A case where some prices rise, some prices fall, and now we have to come up with a way to decide whether the overall price level has risen. So how do we do this? Well, so economists have defined or typically use three measures of inflation. Of these, the most important one probably is this new one called the Consumer Price Index. So the idea behind the Consumer Price Index is to think, all right, why do we care about inflation? We care about it because it is reducing our purchasing power, right? So you have a paycheck, you want to know how much stuff you can buy with it. Well, then you're sort of concerned with whether the prices of the goods that you care about have increased. So the idea behind the Consumer Price Index is to look at what people buy. So the way they actually do this is by surveying urban families. So they want to basically figure out what does the typical urban family of four buy, and then they will give certain prices more or less importance in deciding whether the overall price level has risen, depending on how much that typical family spends on it. So for example, if the typical family spends a lot more money on gasoline than it spends on rubber duckies, then the price, an increase in the price of gasoline is going to matter a lot more for inflation than an increase in the price of rubber duckies, right? And that's sort of sensible. So how do we calculate the CPI? So let's suppose, as I said, the typical consumer spends 70% of her budget on oranges, 30% on apples. So in this case, because the price of oranges matters a lot more to the typical consumer than the price of apples, in that context we talked about earlier, that example where the price of oranges fell and the price of apples rose, here we'd conclude the overall price level has fallen, right? Now it's unambiguous because we sort of set the benchmark here. We've set how important these two prices are relative to one another. All right, does that make sense? Yeah. Then the price level doesn't matter, right, in some sense. So you don't really care about whether the price of that rises. In fact, that's typically going to be something where it's, not priced, right? So, I consider, having a fulfilling relationship with my family to be, extremely valuable. But there's no price on that, right? I don't have to pay for it. It doesn't matter, how much, what the aggregate price level is for that, right? So the idea behind the CPI is to just measure whether people are spending money on things, in which case, what we want to figure out at the end of the day is how much is your paycheck going to buy you, right? So in a case like that, basically, so this is one of the biases. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the biases in the CPI, but this actually comes into play especially when, there's a case where something is important, but you don't spend much money on it. So in that case, the CPI may not be as representative of what we care about. That is one possible problem. The other problem is if people suddenly start spending on things that they never spent on before, right? So if we are comparing to 1980, and we have a price basket defined in 1980, and we're trying to compare it to now, well, how much money do people spend on, smartphones back in 1980? Nothing, right? So this is a potential problem with the CPI. This is why it's a little hard to make comparisons with it in the very, very long run. Now, in the case you're talking about, sometimes they'll define different versions of the CPI. So they'll have like core inflation, which is restricted to certain goods. You can talk about inflation related specifically to food, specifically to gasoline, inflation in the essentials. So they can have different versions of the CPI. Right, and in this class, we're going to stick mainly to the overall CPI, but again, you'll see all of these measures of inflation actually sort of differ to a certain extent. They'll usually agree on the overall pattern, say that the prices have all risen, but part of the reason why we have many different measures of inflation is because none of them are perfect. Other questions? Is that a question or a stretch? Okay. All right. So next measure of inflation, so you've already seen this one, you've already defined it, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but this is the GDP deflator, right? It's just nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. And so this effectively weights prices by production, right? So in some sense, so I won't do the math out for you, but basically the idea is if our economy produces a lot of cars and not very many motorcycles, then the price of cars is going to matter. It's going to move. So changes in the price of cars will move the GDP deflator more than changes in the price of the motorcycles. This is just trying to link it back to the CPI so you can see the difference between the two of them, right? So one of them, this one cares mostly about consumption. What do we spend our money on? This is about production. What do we produce? That's what determines which prices matter the most in our decision for whether the overall price level has changed. So to make that more concrete, you just go over here. So let's suppose that in both of these years, we produce this much. So the total amount of fruit we're producing is not changing, and we're producing the same amount of oranges, the same amount of apples. Now, based on the same example, right, $3 to $2 for oranges, $2 to $3, if this were the case, if this were the difference between how much we produce, this were the change in both of these prices, in this case, in contrast to the CPI, the case where we spend most of our money on oranges, because most of our production comes from apples, in this case, we would conclude that the overall price level rose, right? So if you were to go through and actually calculate the GDP deflator, you'd see that that's actually risen. All right? So as I said, these different measures of inflation can give different answers. It's worthwhile keeping that in mind. And so the measure of inflation you want to use depends on exactly what you're interested in. Why do you want to know whether the overall price level has risen? All right, last point, last one, so I'm not going to spend very much time at all on the producer price index, but I just want to mention it. So the idea here, this differs from the consumer price index. Remember, the consumer price index was asking the typical consumer what they spend on goods. The producer price index is asking a typical firm, what price did you receive for the goods you produced? So the major difference between this one and all the other ones is that this accounts for intermediate goods, right? Because so normally these things, consumers will only buy final goods, right, by definition. If consumers buy it, it is a final good. So that would count things like, the final, so if you buy a TV, that'll count both the TV and everything that comes with it. If you're talking about the producer price index, you would also be worried about the prices of, like, say, cardboard boxes. So consumers don't buy a huge amount of cardboard boxes, at least not unless they're moving. By contrast, producers have to buy boxes because a lot of the things they sell go in boxes, right? So cardboard boxes will matter a lot more in this than they will in this, right? So as I said, these measures differ. So these are the three. So here we have the blue is the GDP deflator, the red is the consumer price index, and the black is the producer price index. So it's a little hard to see, But you can see there are definitely differences between these. So the consumer price index in particular tends to be a lot more volatile, right? You have these big spikes. Consumer price index, though you don't really see, so typically the movements, these will all move in the same direction, but you can see that the GDP deflator and the producer price index are a lot more sedate in their movements. The GDP deflator in particular does not move around a lot. The main reason for that, I believe, is because the consumer price index puts a lot of weight on the price of gasoline, right? So consumers in the US spend a lot of money on gas, so a relatively small change in the price of oil will create a big change in that, how much the typical consumer spends on their price basket, right? All right, so everything clear so far? Everyone understand the idea behind these measures of inflation? Yeah. All right. So just a few useful terms. Inflation, as you know, is a rise in the overall level of prices. So we say there has been inflation. It means the overall prices, as if you pick your favorite measure, the overall prices have risen. Deflation is the opposite, so literally a decrease in the level of prices. Disinflation, so this is about a change in the rate of inflation. So if inflation falls from 5% to 4%, well, we haven't had deflation, right? Prices are still growing, but the rate at which they're growing has decreased, and so we'd say there's been disinflation. All right? So just to give concrete examples here on the graph, so in this case, we've had, anytime we have this, so this is basically the rate of inflation, or the CPI, so anytime we have it above here, above 0, we know there's inflation, right, because there's positive changes in the price level. It's below 0, we are having negative changes, and so it's deflation. And so the example shown over here, where the rate of inflation falls, that's disinflation, right? Any questions? Yeah. So yeah, there's plenty of times here. So here there's disinflation. Here, anytime you see that downward slope, there's going to be a disinflation. Other questions? All right, let me just give you, there's one thing I really want to show you because it's actually of fairly practical importance. It's entirely possible at some point in the next year or two that you will have to calculate a real price, so a price adjusted for inflation, if not for an econ class, possibly in a history class, for example. So let me just give you an example of how you would do this. So let's have an example of how you would deflate a price using the consumer price index. All right, so let's suppose that you wanted to find what has happened to the real price of oranges. So you're going from 2014 to 2015, and so with the CPI, as with the GDP deflator, really with any measure of the overall price level, you have to define a base year. So let's take 2014 as the base year, and so what we want to do here is figure out, okay, what is happening to the price of oranges? So we know that the nominal price is $6. This is just the price that's posted on posted in Safeway or whatever. But we want to know, like, sort of adjusting for inflation, what is the price? And so let's suppose this is our basket, right? So we go out and we survey the typical urban family, and we find out that the typical urban family buys 1 orange and buys 1 apple. All right? So let's calculate the cost of the basket, right? So step 1 here. So we can do this for each year, right? So 2014, cost of the basket is just 1 times $3, so 1 orange plus 1 apple, and it's just $5, right? So what would be the CPI in 2014? Well, we define the CPI as cost of the basket in the current year, so 2014, divided by the cost in the base year. The base year is 2014, right? So this is $5 divided by $5. We multiply by 100 just to make it an index. And so, of course, we find that, as always, the price and the price level in the base year is just 100, right? So the real price, so if you're using 2014 as the base year, then the real price of oranges is $3, the real price of apples is $2, right? Just because by construction we've made this the base year. The more interesting case is 2015. So what is the cost? Just be clear what we're doing here. So the cost 2015, so we're still buying, so we're holding the quantities fixed, right? We keep the basket the same. We're just seeing what that basket would cost under the new set of prices. So we have, again, one orange. Now that orange costs $6. And then we have one apple. The apple costs $5. So we get that the cost has now risen to $11, right? So the CPI, that is cost in 2015 divided by the cost in the base year times 100. And so $11 divided by $5 times 100. And I have my calculator on me, but I wrote down that this is comes out to be about 220. Exactly 220, actually. All right, and that's the CPI. All right, so now what do we do with this? So our aim here is to find the real price of oranges. What is that? Well, the way you calculate that is you take the nominal price. We want to divide by the CPI. And then multiply by 100. Or another way to do this, actually, that might be a bit more intuitive, is to just take the CPI, divide it by 100, and now divide the nominal price by that entire quantity. So what this CPI is telling us is that the price level, the overall price level given this price basket, has risen by a factor of 2.2, right? So we take this and divide it by the base year. The base index is always 100, so we can just put that down there. So in this case, we would have, for oranges, it would be $6 up here. We would have 220 divided by 100 down here. So this is $6 divided by 2.2, which is just about, $2.73, right? Does everyone see where each of those steps is coming from? So why is this useful? It's useful because if you were to just look at the change in nominal prices, you would conclude that, all right, the price of oranges has doubled. But here's the thing. If you calculate the real price, you can see that it's actually fallen, right? The real price of oranges has fallen, even though the nominal price has risen. Why is that? The reason is because although the price of oranges has doubled, the price of apples has more than doubled, right? So what this is telling us is that the price of oranges, though it has risen by less than all the other prices in the economy, essentially. So it means if you care a lot about oranges, then you would be oranges are actually more affordable than they were before. All right? Any questions on that? So if you needed to actually calculate a real price, so I think previously, at least in the lecture on GDP, a few other times I've mentioned FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, so you can go there and actually just download the CPI, so the monthly CPI for the past 50, 60 years or whatever, and then you can skip the step where you calculate all this because you'll just have this already, So you'll take your nominal price, divide it by the CPI, divided by 100, so rescale the CPI by 100, divide by that rescaled number, and that'll give you the real price, all right? All right. So just a quick review of all that. Inflation is a rise in the overall price level. We have three measures of it, or we introduced three measures. So the consumer price index, the GDP deflator, the producer price index. They usually agree on the direction, but not always on the magnitude of inflation. So we talked about inflation, the rise in overall price level, deflation, a decrease in the overall price level, and disinflation, a decrease in the rate of inflation. And then we talked about how you can calculate a real price, for which is just a nominal price or a price adjusted for inflation. All right. Questions on any of that? Yeah. So you want to calculate what is the real price in 2015. So you'd use the CPI in 2015. So you could do it for 2014. The thing is, since 2014 is the base year, you would just get that the real price and the nominal price are the same. It's like with GDP. In the base year, the nominal GDP and the real GDP are the same. Other questions?